Do you all remember last time the experiments that we had up here?
Yes.
And we ended with the exploding volcano? Yeah, that was exciting, wasn't it? And some people said, ooh, it was stinky too. Yeah. Well, that story was the story about how the earth came to be. But today, I'm going to tell you the story of how all life came to be. Plants, animals, and us, the human beings. That's what today's story is about. So, go back with your minds. You can close your eyes if you want to, but you don't have to. Just go back with your minds to the time when the earth was born as a tiny drop. Every particle was given a set of laws, so that when the earth cooled down, everything settled down according to these laws. There was water, the rocks, and surrounding them, all the air. And the earth looked like a beautiful pearl. The sun looked at this beautiful little pearl, and it looked at it day and night because it was so beautiful. But one day, the sun was looking down at the earth, and it saw that something wasn't right. Something was happening. There was trouble. See, it rained a lot on this earth, and as the rain came down, it mixed with a gas, and then all this rain and gas was washing away the rocks and making the sea full, the oceans full of all kinds of salts. And there were also a lot of storms that were breaking up the rocks, and the sea was becoming fuller and fuller. And the land was being washed away. Well, it looked once again that the order that had been created was beginning to break up. The sun looked at the water. And thought, I think the water is causing this problem. And the water said, who, me? This isn't my fault. What have I done? I'm made in such a way that if I become hot, I disappear. And if I get cool, I fall down. And I'm a liquid, so I have to go into the crevices and into the cracks, and that's my nature. What can I do? It's not my fault anyway. It's the fault of the air. That's what I think. And the air said to the sun, me? It's not my fault. Not at all. I was given the job of covering the earth with layers and layers of blankets so she won't be cold. But she has a cold head and she has cold feet, and I have to be busy moving the air, moving myself around and trying to warm her up. But when I try and do that, you know what that silly water does? Well, water jumps on my back and she takes a ride. Well, the air said it's all right for water to jump on my back and take a ride when I'm going flat, but when I have to go up the mountains, it gets harder and harder. I have to climb up and she's very heavy, and then I have to shake her off and drop her. I can't play all the time. I have serious things to do. If you ask me, the air said, the fault is the rocks. Well, Those rocks are so full of wrinkles and bubbles. They don't have any consideration at all. They never get out of my way. So passing next to them, sometimes they're freezing and I have to cringe, and sometimes they're so hot I have to climb up so I don't get burned. Well, the rocks didn't like hearing that. They didn't want to be blamed. No, so they protested and they said, blame us? No way. It's not our fault we get hot. All we do is just sit around. We don't go anywhere. We just sit around, and if the sun shines on us, can we help it that we get hot? No, we can't. And it's just the way we're made. And then the rocks looked up at the sun and they said, I think it's your fault. Well, and so it went on. And you know what? It was really none of their faults. Each one, the solids, the liquids, and the gases, they were all behaving in the way that they had to, in the way according to their own nature. Yet order was being threatened, and something had to be done. Well, what to be done? So then, do you know what happened? Something was created. A tiny, tiny little drop of a jelly-like substance. So tiny that you could not even see it. And to this tiny little drop, God said, I give you something that nothing else has, that no one else has. I give you sensitivity, and in order to exist, you must eat and grow. But all of you will not eat the same thing, and you will have the power to create others like yourselves, and that is your specialty. So then, life came in the form of these tiny little drops of jelly, each of whom had these laws to follow. Eat, grow, and create others like yourselves. So they were like tiny little machines, and they made other tiny little machines by splitting up. It's just like if you had a car going down the street, and the car splits in half and you have two cars. And then those split in half and you have 4 and 8. And these little tiny bits of life just kept splitting and making others like themselves. And through these little tiny drops of jelly began the work of cleaning up the sea. As they fed upon the salts of the earth, they built their own bodies with them. And some of them kind of found the water itchy, so they built shells to protect themselves. And when they died, these tiny little shells dropped to the bottom of the sea, and the salts remained trapped in these tiny shells. And as time passed, and these creatures lived and died, layer upon layer of this new kind of mud piled up on the bottom of the sea like pages in a book, the book of the earth. Some of these pages have remained with us for a very long time so that we can read them later on, so that we could tell what happened so long before any human being was born. And these first tiny little creatures made up of just one cell did all this work. The breathing, the eating, and the getting rid of what they did not want, and drifting around the seas, cleaning it up. But then as time went along, some of them said, why don't we join together? Then we can become even more efficient. We can do things better. And along came slightly bigger creatures, made out of several cells. And they too went on feeding in the water, growing and creating others like themselves, and cleaning the salts out of the water. And this went on for a very, very, very long time. Until some of them thought, instead of having one cell doing all the work of the feeding and the moving around and getting rid of what you can't use, how about some of them do the eating, and you guys over there do the breathing, and you guys be in charge of moving us around. And so some of these cells started to specialize like that, and there we had creatures with arms or legs or mouths or heart. We had creatures with organs. And when the book of Earth opened up, the pages that we can read, all of these types of creatures were already there. We're just going to look at the first part of this timeline here. And our classroom has a timeline of life. And Mr. George's classroom also has a timeline of life. And I'm going to ask somebody to come up here and to hold this edge right here. And, excuse me?
She's blocking, so you can take her.
I'm going to choose somebody else. Thank you for your offer. I'm going to choose Eliza. Yep. And if you could just sit on the side, yeah, in front of me you can even be, and just hold it. You can just keep it held, one hand at the bottom and one hand at the top. Now, is everybody... Yes, everyone does need to have their legs crossed. Good. That keeps everybody flat down, more on the ground. Is there anybody here who's having a hard time seeing? Some of you are having a hard time seeing. So here's what you'll be able to do. When you go back to your classroom later on, you can put your hands down now. When you go back to your classroom later on, you'll be able to get a very, very good look at this. And you'll be able to unroll it and see. And we'll be moving this around even this morning. So we can even see some of these very early creatures right in here. We can see some of these trilobites. We can see some of the early sponges and other creatures that are there. Some of these are even still alive today. Yep, some of them are still alive today. We have an amoeba with no shell around it, made up of just one cell that did all the work. We have these little one-celled creatures also with these little flagellates where they move these little things that look like tails, and they move them to help them move around in the water. We have sponges made up of of cells all doing the same kind of job. There are sea anemones. We have all kinds of animals. And these trilobites, we still have records of those trilobites, and we have some trilobites even in our classroom. We have, they're not live, of course. There are no living trilobites now, but there are trilobites, shells that are found everywhere. Their old bodies are found. And they were a little bit like lobsters of today. And as time went on, all kinds of other animals appeared. We had some cephalopods that had legs attached to their heads. Can you imagine having legs attached to your heads? Well, some of these early experiments were like that. And as time went on, there were different experiments of all kinds. There were even some early animals that looked like flowers. Well, they weren't flowers at all, but they were stone houses built up by jelly-like creatures. And they took salt out of the sea and built up these stone houses. And they had at the top feathery parts that would move around and catch other little animals to eat them. And there were also some other creatures that instead of eating others, some creatures learned to make their own food. Can you imagine that? Instead of having to eat other animals, some of them learned to make their own food. They did this with the salts of the water and the sunlight. And they too drifted around in the sea. And at some point, some of them decided to see what it was like to get out of the ocean. Gee, we're in the ocean all the time. Some of them thought, well, what would it be like if we got out of the ocean? And floating with the tides, they got carried to the very edges of the ocean. And they found out that the air outside of the water was filled with a gas that they could use to make up for food. So they remained at the edge of the seas, feeding themselves, and when they died, their bodies remained, preparing the ground for others to come. They were the first plants that there were on the land. So at the first time, life was trying to get out onto the land. Now, at the same time that this was going on, two new animals appeared at the very same time. One helped in the building up of our lands everywhere, and those are the corals. And then there was a strange little animal with a rod inside its body. See, until now, if the animal had a shell, it was on the outside. But this one had a rod on the inside, and it was the beginning of animals with bones. Yes. And in time, this animal developed into the very first fish. Well, these fish were very different from the fish of our day. And once this experiment became a success, a great variety of fish appeared. Some were big with great armor all around them for protection. Some of them remained buried in the mud, and then they would pop up and catch their prey. But you know what? What then began to happen? Over a long, long, long period of time, over such a long period of time, some of the land started to rise up. And here and there, as the land rose up, it closed off the water. And at some places, with no rain, the land began to dry up. Well, if you need water for your life, and it dries up, what are you going to do? You have to solve the problem. And some of the fish that were trapped in these places thought, I'm going to make a little sack inside my body, and I'm going to line it with water. That way I'll be able to breathe without water. And they discovered the secret of living outside of water. And there came the very first amphibians. The very first creatures that could live outside of water. And they lived partly in the water, and they lived partly on land. And we had animals like frogs and salamanders appeared. And with them, you know what happened? There became the very first voice. The very first voice happened. The very first animal that could make a sound. That came with the amphibians. With those amphibians, the fins that they had had in the water became useless, and they got changed into legs to walk on land. The amphibians enjoyed their life on the land, for there were also plants. They were growing fast and they had plenty to eat, because you know what else happened at the same time? There were insects. Oh, and they had so much to eat. But there was one little problem. Because they needed to be around water, some of them began not to like it. And they had to be around water because of the way their skins were made, and they had to lay their eggs in the mud, had to be laid in the mud. But some of them began to not like it. So, what did they do? How did they solve this problem of not liking to be around the water, wanting to be able to get away from the water? Some of them developed a skin that was dry and scaly, and a skin that didn't dry up even in the sun. And they also invented eggs that had a shell around them that didn't need to be in the water and didn't need to be in the mud. That way they could move around more freely and they didn't have to be stuck to the water. And these were the reptiles. So for the first time, we had animals on the earth that weren't tied to the water, ones that could move a great distance away. They could roam freely. And they went further and further into the land. Oh, this was new. There was nobody there to stop them. And they roamed around, and the reptiles became almost like the lords and masters of the land. They invaded everywhere, even the air. They grew and grew and grew. And they had bony skeletons inside to support the weight of their muscles. And some of them grew to be enormous sizes. Look at this one. Look at this one. This reptile was so large. That's a regular human being. Someone who's my height. Now look how much larger that dinosaur is. That's how big the human being would be. Some of these dinosaurs just were gigantic. And look at this one. Now, here's the size of a human being. And look at the head of this one. Why, his head is much bigger than even a whole human being. Imagine me standing here and there's a creature with a head that's bigger than I am. Now, if you can imagine some of these guys walking around, think of how the earth would shake. So huge and heavy. Oh my goodness. And with that big long dinosaur, the first one that we saw, that Brontosaurus, he was so long that he had to have two brains. He had one brain in his head, and he had another brain way down in his tail. That told that part of his body where to move, because his tail was just too far away from that brain in his head. If his tail was bitten, he'd have no way of knowing unless he had that second brain in his tail. Well, as some of these huge reptiles moved around, some of these reptiles wanted to go further and further into land, but there were some areas that were so cold that they didn't want to go there, because the reptiles and the salamanders weren't able to keep their bodies warm by themselves. And in those colder regions where they went, where some of them remained, it just didn't work out so well. And as time went on, there were some other smaller animals that began to develop. They were smaller than some of these huge reptiles. And they were able to go into areas that the reptiles did not want to go into. The reptiles didn't want to go into the cold areas, but these new kinds of animals that were created, these new kinds of animals were able to go into these colder areas. And they were able to take the eggs that the reptiles had left all over. Because the reptiles didn't care for their young. Hardly any of them cared for their young. They would lay their eggs and then just go away. And so there was plenty of food for these new kinds of animals that had developed. And these were the birds and the mammals. And the birds and the mammals, to be able to live in colder areas, they had to develop a covering on their body that would keep them warm. Well, the birds, they developed feathers, and the animals developed fur. The mammals developed fur on their bodies, and that kept them warm, and it let them go to places where the reptiles wouldn't go. And the birds and the mammals cared for their young in ways that the reptiles and salamanders and fish never did. The birds would lay eggs and then protect the eggs and sit on them. And they would take care of any animal that tried to come up and get those eggs. And the mammals kept the eggs warm in their bodies until they were ready to be born. And then the mothers fed them with milk. Well, this was very new. The reptiles didn't do this. The parents of mammals and birds stayed with their young until they could take care of themselves. And if anyone came to eat the babies, the parents took care of them. Well, this was a new way of caring. hardly any of the reptiles did this. And by the time these new animals had arrived, the weather began to change. It steadily grew colder and colder, and the reptiles who had no feathers or fur to warm themselves began to die out. And the mammals took over. With enough food around, it was time for those mammals to grow huge. There were some giant pigs and huge hippopotamuses, and there were elephants with enormous tusks that are not around today. Just gigantic, gigantic creatures. The weather got colder and colder until large sheets of ice covered almost the whole earth. But in the end, none of those giant mammals survived. But then, towards the very end of this cold period, a completely new kind of animal came on the scene. Something that had never been before. It didn't have fur like the other animals. It didn't have huge teeth or didn't have big claws. But it had something that none of the others had. It had a mind to think with. It had a larger brain, and it had the power to think. It was able to imagine and reflect. None of the animals could do that. But this new creature could. Its brain was so big, it could imagine and think, and also think back to things that had happened before. And it also had an enormous amount of love, a love that was different than any creature that had come before. This was a totally new kind of animal. This was a human being. With human beings, love went beyond their own children. It went to others of their kind, even to those men, women, and children they would not ever see. And it was as though the earth had to have this long preparation time to make it ready for the special creature. If human beings had appeared in any of these earlier times, it wouldn't have been possible for them to live. But now, everything was ready. It was as though the earth had been waiting and waiting and waiting for the human beings. And the earth said to the human beings, look at all this that I've gotten ready for you. There are trees with wonderful fruits. There are plants that you can eat. There are animals. I've made everything ready for you. And now it's time, it's your time. And it's time now for the coming of human beings. And that's my story for today. The story of the coming of life.